So thank you to Norman for putting that very thoughtful piece together. And in there was what I think probably everyone would agree is a pretty shocking statistic, that 71% of companies believe they have slavery in their supply chain at some point. Is that okay? Well, there's one man who believes it isn't okay, and that is Nick Grono. Nick is an Australian human rights activist. He is the CEO of the Freedom Fund, and the Freedom Fund was announced by Bill Clinton in 2013 with a remit to get together the knowledge and the capital to end slavery. So Nick's going to give us a keynote which will set the foundation for our panel discussion afterwards, which will, as always, be chaired by Axel Threlfall. So ladies and gentlemen, could you please put your hands together for Nick Grono.
Thanks, Jim. So last month I went to Thailand, and unfortunately it wasn't for a holiday to sit on a beach. It was actually to go and learn more about slavery in the Thai seafood industry. And slavery is rife in the Thai seafood industry, as I'm sure many of you have heard through some of the excellent reporting that's been done by The Guardian and others. These trips can be pretty confronting because you're going down to places where you're meeting with victims who have been subject to horrendous exploitation, and you're seeing firsthand the conditions that they're living and working in. But it's also tremendously important to see this firsthand. I mean, certainly for my organisation, the Freedom Fund, we have a big program of work in Thailand around this issue, and it's very important for me to hear firsthand from those that are directly impacted by this horrendous crime. And so slavery in the Thai seafood industry takes various forms. You get slavery on the fishing boats, and this is a photo I took down at one of the ports we went down to, Songkhla, a big port in the south of Thailand. You get slavery on these fishing boats. You get slavery in the prawn peeling sheds. You know, these nice prawns that end up on our sushi have been peeled. Well, they're often peeled by migrants who are subject to horrendous exploitation. And you get slavery in the fish processing plants as well. But it's the fishing boats that we've heard a lot about recently through some of the wonderful reporting that's been done. So on a boat like this, you probably have about 15 or 20 crew. You'll have a Thai captain, Thai first officer, and most of the crew will probably then be migrants from Burma or Cambodia. And they will have come to Thailand seeking a better life and better pay. They'll often meet up, the way this usually happens is they'll meet up with a recruiter who offers them a job for a fee, for a debt. So they take the job, go on a boat, they're promised a certain salary and certain working conditions, and of course find out far too late when they're on the boat and on the sea that in fact the reality is very different. On these boats, they can go to sea for a week or weeks on end. They are often subject to truly horrendous violence. They work 20-hour days while they're at sea. They witness violence. I mean, I've met numerous former victims who have seen crewmates thrown over the side when they're extremely ill, because it's cheaper to dispose of sick crew members than come back into port or care for them, to produce the fish that we eat and some of the other products that make their way into the seafood supply chain. These are 4 individuals I met while I was down there, Cambodians. The one in the middle with his eyes blacked out is a 13-year-old boy who joined a fishing boat at the age of 12. They all left their Cambodian village to seek a better life, promised certain things, ended up on this boat with a debt, subject to the kind of violence I've been talking about. And they're caught in a vicious circle because they owe a debt. They will be threatened with violence if they don't pay this debt, even though the debt is illegal. And you know, when they're on a boat, they're not being paid the salary they're promised. They come into port, they receive no money, they have very little option but to stay on a boat. They're often confined, but not always confined. They're usually controlled by this form of coercion. These 4 escaped after 18 months, terrified, distressed, wanting to go back to Cambodia, and worried about the consequences. We work with partners. This was Stella Mara Centre that provides some of the psychosocial support and other support to get them back. So that's exploitation in the Thai seafood industry. The way it works is you have a situation where you have weak rule of law. Certainly doesn't protect vulnerable populations. You have highly vulnerable populations. So, here we're talking about migrants that just don't get protected by the law. But in other situations, it might be your gender that makes you vulnerable. It might be that you're a victim of war. It might be that you're a lower caste individual in India where you're not respected because of your caste or because of your religion as a minority. And there's demand for excessively cheap labour. And what we find with trafficking is that you have a whole nexus of crimes. It's not just, human trafficking itself or modern slavery is actually a combination of crimes. You have fraud and deception, you have violence, you may have kidnapping, extortion. Of course, there are laws in Thailand about wages, working conditions, all of which are being flouted. This boat that these guys were on for 18 months was inspected 20 times by Thai authorities and didn't pick up the exploitation or didn't act on the exploitation, didn't pick up on the fact that there's a 12 and 13-year-old boy working on the boat. And you also find that other crimes, there's this nexus of crimes that surround slavery. So, it's not just the direct exploitation. I took this photo of a boat just approaching a dock, spewing out these horrible fumes. And again, when you have slavery, you have an undermining of the rule of law. If you're enslaving people, if you're not paying them, if you're using violence, you're not worried about environmental regulation. You're not worried about regulations on the size of fish. This catch, all undersized. We were with an expert who said all of these fish are undersized. So they will go either into pet food, make their way into supply chains that way, or into fish meal. The fish meal is used to feed the prawn farms or the fish farms, or, we're hearing now, chicken farms. So soon you'll find, and you'll start seeing reporting about slavery making its way into chicken supply chains. And of course, Thailand is a major exporter of fish, and its fish makes its way onto supermarket shelves here in the UK. And I suspect with more reporting, we'll find its chickens do as well. So, this is Thailand. I'm talking about this. Most of you are not involved in the seafood industry, but I suspect that most of you eat seafood. Right? So this is the way that slavery touches us all. Here it's the seafood, but it's also the smartphones that we use, which may have minerals that have been mined in the Congo, where forced labour is used by militias or by rebel groups to produce the minerals that make their way into our mobile phones. Those mobile phones may be assembled in the Philippines or in China, where there are regular reports of bonded labour in electronics manufacturing industry. We all wear cotton clothes. This is a girl in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan, a major international producer of cotton. Every year, the government conscripts large chunks of its population into picking cotton. That cotton makes its way into the factories in India or Bangladesh or Pakistan. I've been down to Tamil Nadu, where you have the factories making the cotton yarn and the cotton cloth, where there's a high incidence, often, of forced and bonded labour of adolescent girls. And those garments are manufactured in places like Bangladesh or Turkey. Turkey, we're hearing reports of Syrian refugee children being found to be working in manufacturing plants. So, we're all touched by this. This next clip is one that always distresses me a little, particularly anyone here who has a young girl or a child. I've got a 6-year-old daughter. This was taken by one of our partners in Bihar, clandestinely. And this girl is working in a stone quarry with her family, because the whole family's been enslaved, breaking stones. There is no economic basis to this, right, other than the fact that you can exploit these people for absolutely no cost, breaking small rocks into smaller rocks. This is not an international supply chain issue, right? This is product used for construction in the Indian construction industry. But it kind of illustrates to me, this girl, without intervention, will work in this environment. Health will suffer tremendously, inhaling dust every day, the physical labour, no education. As she grows older, almost certainly subject to sexual abuse. And there's just this horrendous cycle of exploitation. And it's this kind of exploitation, while this may not itself be an international supply chain issue, very similar forms of exploitation in India are. And there's been recent reporting again in The Guardian about mica mines, a mineral mined in India as a child labourer, which is used to produce the glitter that goes in cosmetics and also into paint used for high-end cars. So this is an international supply chain issue. So, the point I'm trying to make, it's not just a corporate supply chain issue, it's something that touches all of us as consumers in one way or another. But of course, that begs the question, what are the implications for those corporates doing business in the UK? And the starting point for that issue is the Modern Slavery Act, which came into force last year. It was championed by the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, and it's a very good act. It provides a lot of conceptual clarity around some of the key definitions, and it also has provisions in there around transparency in supply chains. There are requirements for companies that do business over $36 million international turnover to publish an annual statement of what they're doing, what policies they have, what measures they're taking to deal with modern slavery and forced labour in their supply chains, if they're doing anything. This, to my mind, is a very important development, as evidenced by the fact of widespread business interest in what are the implications for business. It now means we've got transparency in supply chain provisions in California and the UK, so two big economies requiring transparency. We are working with others to ensure that those statements are being collected and published so that people can start examining who's doing what, who's saying, who's not doing what. And I think, and this is probably the key point of my presentation, what we're seeing is the beginning point of greater regulation around this issue. We're certainly not at kind of peak regulation. I suspect we're going to see a lot more focus on this issue and a lot more regulatory attention. And there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, there's just growing awareness of this issue. There's some magnificent investigative journalism that's being done by The Guardian, by the New York Times. The Associated Press got a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting on the Thai seafood industry, just beating out the New York Times for some magnificent reporting it did on slavery at sea. CNN has long been running articles on slavery, Al Jazeera, so that's only going to grow. Thomson Reuters Foundation has a whole team working on slavery issues. And NGOs are getting much more focused on investigative reporting around this issue. We're seeing much greater political attention being paid to this issue. I came into this space about 4 years ago, exactly 4 years ago, and the first event I went to was one where President Obama was announcing that modern slavery was a tremendously important issue for his government. Hillary Clinton has put out a statement saying that they will make a focus on modern slavery a priority of her administration if she's elected. And of course, Prime Minister Theresa May came out almost straight after she was appointed as Prime Minister, saying that slavery is one of the great human rights issues of our time and committing the British government to international leadership on this issue. So we are going to see a much greater focus. We're already seeing other regulatory issues around, or other regulatory attention around this issue. The US government has passed some pretty stringent regulations under a presidential order around transparency and due diligence for those supplying to the US government. They've also recently tightened up their customs regulations, giving more powers to their customs authorities to intercept goods that may have been manufactured with or produced with child labour, forced labour. We've got a EU non-reporting financial directive that comes into effect at the end of the year that will require big firms to state much more openly about what they're doing with due diligence in their supply chain. So, there's lots of stuff going around. The Australian government's doing a whole lot of stuff around the barley process. And I also suspect that what we're going to see with the UK government's desire to focus on this issue is that they will look to promote the transparency in supply chain provisions internationally, not least to make sure there's a level playing field for those that are already caught by the UK regulation. And they've got the vehicle of the Commonwealth, the OECD, G7, G20, World Bank to do that. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see some kind of movement along the lines of what we've seen with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Bribery Act around corruption practices and promoting those through the vehicle of the OECD. And those acts themselves, I think, also will come into much more prominence around the whole slavery issue. My organisation, the Freedom Fund, has published a couple of reports kind of saying, look, whether or not you're focused on slavery as an issue, if you have a large migrant workforce in a developing country and there's a risk of bonded labour, then almost certainly there's corruption. Corruption around permits, visas to come in the country, visas to remain in the country, health permits, labour checks, corrupt payments there. So you need to start looking from a compliance perspective around those issues. And we haven't even started on things like anti-money laundering or know your client regulations, but again, we'll be looking to do a report on that before the end of the year. So, this is where things are moving, like it or not. We, of course, like it because we think that, it's a tremendously important issue for all of us. But what does it mean for companies and for people like you who are grappling with these issues and looking for kind of concrete solutions, and how does one come to grips with this? And if you do have the will, what can you do? And unfortunately, the answer is not a straightforward one. Right? I mean, I think these issues are difficult and challenging for corporates, well-meaning corporates, to come to grips with. If you have an extended supply chain, that ends up with significant workforce in developing countries that suffer these kind of problems, it is a real challenge. And we talk to corporates who say, well, it's really hard to get past tier 1, let alone past tier 2. And what that means, I think, is that companies will have to start looking at doing business differently. I think we're past peak extension of supply chains where the focus has been on maximum flexibility and minimum cost and pushing the risk down the chain. And the reality is, if you do that, you're not going to have sight over what's happening at tier 2 or tier 3 because you're consciously closing your eyes to it. And to develop kind of knowledge of what's happening requires relationships. Right? We talk to tier 1 suppliers who say, well, we're being told we have to know who all our suppliers are and have to know who their suppliers are, but we're not going to be paid anymore. And the incentives are not there for us to actually take those steps because it costs money, it takes time, and until there's an understanding of that, then it's not economic for us. So I think there needs to be a change in awareness. I think it's the right thing to do. Increasingly, it will be the legal thing to do. It means getting beyond compliance. I thought the point from the Grant Thornton video was very good, but it means actually doing business differently. It's not just getting beyond compliance. One of the challenges of business is just a lack of awareness around risk. That is changing because what this legislation is doing is changing the market incentives around this space. So you are getting firms like Thomson Reuters developing products that provide greater visibility into these issues. SAP, Palantir are all developing products around supply chains and risk and knowledge. There are consultancies like Deloitte and Grant Thornton that are building up practices around these issues to assist businesses. So, so there is a greater focus on all of these issues. I also think there's an opportunity for British businesses to get on top of this because we are going to see a push for this regulation internationally. So, that perhaps is the business case. But of course, in the end, I would argue that it's the moral case. This is an abhorrent crime. This is 13-year-olds being subject to horrendous exploitation, being deprived of their liberty. It's 5-year-old girls being forced to work in mines. This is something that the abolitionists of 200 years ago understood. I am just full of admiration for their courage and their craziness in setting out in the late 1700s to challenge this industry that was just accepted around the world. Slavery as a concept, I mean, all of the world kind of accepted slavery as a core part of the way things were done. And huge pillars of British society dependent on slavery for trade and commerce. The cotton industry, the sugar industry, rum, tobacco. Within 20 years, they passed legislation banning it. Now, it took another 20 or 30 years to get that enforced, but I think it's time for us to kind of complete that wonderful mission. And I think we all have a role in making a difference. And I think that's really important, and I hope that you will join us in making that difference. So thank you very much.